Hope everyone is having a great day. We still have quite a few out, obviously. I got a text from Ronnie right before we started Bible study this morning. They said they were in Louder getting fuel and they were heading this way. So I'm not exactly sure I remember exactly where Louder is, but I think that's where you hit the interstate, isn't it? Anyway, they are definitely on their way back, and if everything goes well, they'll be back in time for evening services. So just continue to keep everybody that's traveling in your prayers as they are. It's not just our youth group; it's a lot of different youth groups coming back from the Pigeon Forge area. So just kind of keep everybody in your prayers. Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11 through 16. Y'all have heard me preach on and talk about. I want to come this morning with just a few thoughts from it, because to me it's very important for us to understand who we are and what we are. It's not just a matter of being a Christian. It's not just a matter of living as a Christian. There's a lot more involved in how we do that. And one of those areas that's so important is the term exhortation. When you really think about that term, when you think about that word, it's part of the word exhort. And the word exhort means to build up, to make better, to build stronger, to help one another. Not to be the same, not to be confused with, actually I've got that backwards. But when you think about exhorting someone, you're talking about helping them. There are points where we need to help one another. We need to build one another up. We need to work with one another. And so I want us to think about that in our understanding that we have. But if you'll read with me, I'm going to start in verse 11. And I want us to have a clear understanding that, remember the word that he uses here when he talks about he and himself, he's talking about Christ. So you actually could substitute Christ in for those. But it says, and he, Christ, himself, gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ, till we all come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a perfect man, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, that we should no longer be children tossed to and fro, and carried about with every wind of doctrine by the trickery of men and the cunning craftiness of deceitful plotting. But speaking the truth in love may grow up in all things unto him who is the head, Christ, from whom the whole body joined and knit together by whatever or every joint supplies, according to the effective working by which every part does its share, causing growth of the body for the edifying of itself in love. I want to key in on a word that I used here and I kind of stressed, and that's edifying. Because it's true that through it, the Bible teaches us and gives us understanding of how and what we are to use to edify one another. And edifying, that helps us in building up. The exhorting understanding, and I used that wrong. I said exhorting, but I meant edifying. The exhorting is warning. And that's one way that we do edify. We warn one another of the coming dangers and of the sin that's around us. But edifying has that realization of strengthening one another. And the Bible has various uses for this word, and various uses in the way that it does. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 12 through 27, we see that term used in edifying one another. We see it used in Romans 14 and verse 7 when Paul writes and says, "For none of us lives for himself, and no one dies to himself." You see, we're all to help one another. We're to edify. We're to strengthen. We're to be there for one another. And when the church realizes exactly how important each other is, there's an amazement of what we can do and how we can do it. I firmly believe that one of the issues we have today is we're too focused on self and not focused enough on God and on what God requires of us. And when you look around and you see all the things that people say is good in worship and how they enjoy this or how they enjoy that, we have to ask ourselves, is that for us? Do we get pleasure out of it? Well, I draw pleasure from all of us singing together. I really do, because it's amazing. I've been in times where I'll stop singing. Have you ever done that? You just stop singing and start listening? It is amazing, especially the more you have in the group that's singing. It's amazing, and the sound that's brought out and the joy that you can have from it. But we're not in this for ourselves. We're in this for one another. We're here to help and to increase and to grow in that means. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 9, for we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field. You are God's building. We are his fellow workers. Ephesians, we just read in verses 11 through 16 in chapter 4. Have that realization as we work together. We build up one another. We edify one another. We strengthen one another. We give one another what we need to sustain in this life. I remember one time hearing someone say, sometimes I would just like to get away from everything. I would like to just get away, live in the woods, be a hermit, and not be bothered by anyone. That sounds all fine and dandy, doesn't it? Not having to deal with a bunch of craziness, not having to deal with other people, not having to deal with all that. But do you know what we miss out on when we do that? We miss out on the camaraderie of other Christians. We miss out on the simplicity of the love that God has given us. And we miss out on opportunities to help others see what God has done and how they can have what we have. Yeah, it would be great to get away from it all. But we can't stay away. We have to be able to utilize what God's given us and be what God desires of us. What are some responsibilities towards other Christians? Well, I hope these help you, and unfortunately, because we don't have the PowerPoint this morning, you really don't get to see them on the board. But what are some responsibilities toward other Christians? Number one, I must, by love, serve others. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 13. I must serve, not just serve. It's one thing to serve someone, but serving with love. Doing it because I desire to. Showing the gratitude and the love that I have toward others by being their servant. That's a very important issue that you and I have. When we have the men that serve on the table, as we say, they're doing that out of love. They're doing that out of the joy that they have in being able to do that. Can you imagine the night in which Jesus was betrayed? Do you remember, as John records, that he got up and he took a towel and wrapped it around himself, and then he took the basin that they had of water and he went and he was washing the disciples' feet? Can you imagine how lowly that must have seemed to the disciples? I mean, think about Peter. Lord, I'm not going to allow you to do this. I'm not allowing you to subject yourself to wash my feet. You see, even Peter understood how lowly a job that is, how demeaning that must have been to Christ. But it wasn't demeaning, because Christ teaches them, unless you learn to serve one another. You see, that's what he was teaching them, even in washing their feet. They're no better than either one of the others that were sitting next to them. And you and I can learn a great lesson from that. Number two, I must practice the golden rule of Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12. It's interesting because the golden rule of the world is do unto others before they do it to you. But the Bible says, do unto others as you would have them do to you. In other words, what he's saying is, you do to others how you want to be treated. You want someone to treat you with love, you treat them with love. You want someone to go the second mile, you go the second mile. You want someone to be a servant, you serve them. Do unto others. Allow yourself to be humbled enough to help others, and so that they can help you. I think about that as I look at our world and I look at our people today, and I think we are so lost because we've got this mentality about me, and we've got to get away from the me and get more to the you. Have you ever thought about that? What brings joy to us? Others serving us or us serving others? You see, it's all about how we look at life. I picked something up from Dennis Jones when I was at school that I use quite readily. And that is, when it rains, people will say, oh, it's raining outside. I was like, no, man, it's liquid sunshine. Y'all remember him saying that? For those of you that may have known him, liquid sunshine. It's an amazing thing. And somebody looked at me one day and they said, what in the world is wrong with you? And I said, it's all about the way you view things. If we view it as liquid sunshine, it's not dragged. It's not downcast. It's not, because let's face it, when it storms, what do we have? We have overcast skies. It gets dark, and we look at it in that term. It's just sad. But yet, if we look at it in the other way, you ever been walking down the street and see it raining on one side of the street and sunshine on the other? Isn't that amazing? Why can't we have that all the time? Even when it's raining, we can have the sunshine. There is sunshine in my soul, blessed sunshine. Do we believe that? We need to practice that with others. Teach them these things. Number 3, I must worship with other members. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25. Teaches us not to forsaking the assembly as others have. And the idea there is, don't go back into what you once had. Don't go back in and live that old life that you once lived and turn away from the blessings by which you have. Now remember, he's writing to Hebrews. And in that, he's writing to these Hebrews that may be persecuted by other Hebrews because they are leaving the Hebrew teachings and doctrines to embrace the teachings of Christ. Well, in Thomaston, Georgia, I found there is this thing called segregation. Now, I grew up that it didn't matter the color of the skin the individual had. You loved them anyway. That's the way I was taught, okay? And I firmly hold on to that. I have friends of multiple colors, and no, not themselves, each one individually multiple colors, but you understand what I'm saying. And yet, while I was in Thomaston, I noticed that there was the white side of town and the black side of town. Y'all remember when we used to have the white congregation and the black congregations? How's that Christianity? And so, as we were there, I noticed this. But then I also noticed something else. The media always wants to try to spin it that the whites have a problem with the blacks and the blacks have a problem with the whites. In Thomaston, Georgia, if a black person associated with a white person outside of work or something else they were involved in together, if they associated with them with the other color outside, they weren't persecuted by the other color. The whites didn't persecute the blacks and the blacks didn't persecute the whites. The blacks persecuted the blacks and the whites persecuted the whites for working together. And I thought, how stupid is this? Isn't that the way it is, though? I hear people a lot saying, oh, well, I can worship God without having to be at the assembly. It's stupid to be at the assembly. Bunch of hypocrites there. Well, you know what? Had a friend of mine, I think I may have told y'all about this in Cave City, that taught me a valuable lesson that she used on her husband when he said that. Well, there's a bunch of hypocrites in that building. And she said, well, you can either be in that building with those hypocrites for a couple of hours a week, or you can be in hell for eternity with them. Which one do you want? And I went, that was a pretty good answer. Because the Bible tells us to assemble. It teaches us to be with one another. We come together we don't come together just to be together. We come together for this memorial feast that we partake of. Remember, we talked about that in Bible class this morning, Acts chapter 20 and verse 7. He waited until the first day. Paul could have had a common meal with him any time during the week because he was there for 7 days. But he waited to break bread with them because they could only do that on the first day of the week. We come together to break bread, There's the key. And when we focus around the table, when we focus around why we're here, it helps us in the other areas by which we do the singing and the praying and the worshiping of God. And it means that brings it to a deeper understanding. No, you can't worship God without being in the assembly if you want to do it God's way. Can you worship God outside of the assembly? Yeah, you can. Doesn't necessarily mean you're worshiping God God's way, however. And that's something that needs to be understood. We need to learn to work together and worship together. If you don't like them and you can't be around them for an hour, you might find yourself around them for eternity. Just something to think about. Number 4, I must learn to work with others. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 5 through 8. I think this is a key issue. Learning to work with others. You know, I always tell people all the time, and I think it's neat when we have these young kids that work with us at Chick-fil-A, because one of the things I always say is, everybody needs to work with the public somewhere in their life. Everybody does. Because some of the worst people you're going to meet is going to be from what we call the public. And we've got to learn to deal with people. We've got to learn how to work with them. It is amazing when you have somebody come in and they've had a bad day. You never know what type of person you're. Maybe they lost a loved one. Maybe they lost their job. Maybe they've just had a really bad day all the way around. And who's the one that usually ends up being taken out on is the one that they're talking with at that moment. You and I have that same issue, though. Not every first day of the week we wake up and everything's peachy keen, is it? We wake up and everything goes wrong. And we're struggling and we're trying to get everybody to the church building, and we're trying to get them out on time, and we're trying to get to and sometimes we got to have an attitude adjustment. We've got to learn to work with one another. I remember when I was in the Corps, one of the things that they taught us is how to work as a team. And you may not like the guy that was next to you, but they had a unique thing. And I was explaining this to somebody else just recently. In the Marine Corps, in a platoon, you usually had about 4 or 5 squads in a platoon. In that platoon, in that squad, you had what was called fire teams. And there usually was 4 or 5 fire teams to each squad. And each of those fire teams had 4 to 5 individuals, depending on how large each fire team was. And each of those individuals had a particular job. And you had to rely that the other guy was going to do his job. You had to. Because if you didn't, somebody was going to die. It's just the way it is. Somebody once asked me, they said, "How do you feel about women in combat?" And my exact answer was, I don't have a problem with her being in combat as long as the guys around her are thinking about their job and not about her. I don't have a problem in combat with a female as long as I know that if I get wounded, she's going to be able to get me out of that area. You see, we've got to learn to work together. And in certain situations, there's things that some can't do that some can. And in some situations, those that can't need to allow those that can to do what needs to be done. Because there's areas that those that can't do that particular job can do something else that works just as well. When we talk about building up the body, that's what we need to think about in our life. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 3 for number 5. I must learn to exhort and encourage. You know, the easy part's getting mad at somebody, isn't it? The easy part's giving them a piece of your mind, as we say. Well, I can't believe that you did that. Or I can't believe. You ever had somebody come to you and say, "Did you hear what such and such did? I cannot believe that they did that." You know what that's called, right? Gossip. So we're going to go gossip about one another. Happens in the church all the time, doesn't it? Such and such did this and such did that. I was on a campaign one time, and I was sitting there and having lunch with the group I was there with. And well, I should say Heather and I were there because she was with the ladies and I was with the guys. And the guys started talking about this congregation and how bad this congregation was and how they were doing this and they were doing that. And I said, guys, I don't mean to sound ugly about this, but have y'all been to that congregation yet? What do you mean? Well, I know what congregation you're talking about. And my question to you is, have you gone and witnessed what they're doing? Well, no. Then how can you talk about it? If you personally don't know, how can you talk about it? And they were like, well, have you? And I said, I happen to have been there this morning. And I didn't see any of what you said. Did that mean that there wasn't issues with that congregation? No. But it did mean that I had seen some things. My wife and I, as we attended services with that congregation at times, we saw some stuff that I did not agree with. I don't go there now when I go in that area. But I also am not going to go and talk about another congregation that I don't know anything about. Heard a lot of information about a congregation in our community. Well, I shouldn't say our community, in our city. How they do this and how they do that. And yet every time I'm there, I know some of the members. I talk with some of the members. I ask them, no, we don't do that. It's amazing how gossip runs. We need to start realizing that we need to stop tearing down and start building up. That's where encouragement comes from. You ever seen that person that's just had a really bad day and everything's going wrong with them? And you can walk into them and you can see it. They just been having that day. What do? Oh, you'll get over it. No. You put your arm around them and you say, hey, what's going on? Oh, man, it's just this and this and this. Man, I understand. I've had that day too. You know what? It may seem bad right now, but you know what's going to happen? Things are going to turn around. And things are going to get better. We find ways to encourage. Now, are there moments that we need to warn? Oh, yeah. We need to warn one another. Hey, watch out for that pothole. Boom. You know, going down the road, my wife and I were taking a young lady we were all heading to Huntsville. And we had a particular location we were going to, a bookstore there. And we're driving down the 565 and we're coming up and she's talking with us. The next thing I know, she says, hey, that was our exit. You know, a little bit of warning before we got to it would have been great. We've got to learn to warn one another before they fall into the ditch. We've got to be able to help and encourage in the same sense. Number 6, I must strive to be a good example. 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 12. This is the key. Being a good example is the key. We've got to learn to look at ourselves and ask, am I able to tell someone or to encourage someone? Am I able to be what I mean? You know who our worst judge is? We are our worst judge. Man, let me tell you, I do something and I'm the first one to say, man, that was the worst thing. And Heather will say, oh, no, it's okay. No, it's not. Same thing with her. She'll say, man, I can't believe I did. You're all right. No, I'm not. We're our own worst critic. And when others are working to help us, we need to allow that to occur so that we can be that example to others. Sometimes being our own worst critic is good, and sometimes it's not. And in those areas where it's good is when we are allowing ourselves to say, you know what, I could have done this a little bit better. Let me try it a little better. And then we do, and we make it to where, and then people look at us and they say, that's what I want to be like. Somebody asked me, they said, does it bother you that you don't get to be on some of these preaching seminars and stuff? And I said, no. And they said, why not? And I said, because I'm not saying I wouldn't love to be on some of them. But I would rather be an example to someone and help them than be known for the seminars. I'd rather be known as an encourager, as being an example, and edifying and lifting up. Number 7, I must seek to make the church a happy place of love and harmony in which others can be Christians and more easily go to heaven. A lot longer than the other ones, huh? Acts chapter 20 and verse 32. Isn't this where we're supposed to come for joy? Isn't this where we're supposed to come for comfort and for help and for edification and to be able to build up and to do we walk out of services encouraged and like, man, that was great? Or do we walk out and say, what just happened? I've been in congregations where I've walked out, even as a preacher, I've walked out with, man, services just weren't right today. Partly my blame. As the preacher, I can look at myself and say, that sermon stunk. Maybe I should have done a little better job on it. And then there's other times where I can look and I can say, man, that was great. What can I do now? I remember before I became a preacher, there was times where I would walk out of services and I'd feel like I did when I came in. It didn't do any good for me. And then there were times I walked out and the first thing I wanted to do was tell somebody. It was one Sunday morning when I was at Roosevelt Roads in Jacksonville, North Carolina. And we got out of services and I was so excited, and there was 3 of us. We decided to go get something to eat, and we're sitting there and the server brings our food and we're eating, and she comes up and she says, "Is there anything else I can do for you?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "What's that?" I said, "Man, we had a great lesson on this Sunday morning. It'd be great to see you come and join us tonight." I felt so willing to share at that moment. And it all came from the joy I got from the building, from the group, and for the things that we did. Very quickly, in closing, here are the areas that we need to learn to edify one another. You ready? Number 1, the pulpit. If our sermons are not edifying our congregation, we need to rethink what we're doing. I hear people all the time say, "Oh, well, I didn't get anything out of the lesson." Now, I'm going to say there's 2 sides to this coin. If you've not heard me say this, you're about to. There are 2 sides to the coin of I didn't get anything out of the lesson. Number 1, there may not have been anything for you to get out of the lesson. Because if a preacher is telling nothing but stories and not telling you anything about the Bible, you need to get rid of the preacher. He's not a preacher, he's a storyteller. And if he's telling stories and he's not preaching the Bible, there's issues. And I'm going to tell you, you're going to have issues later. The second thing about that, though, is sometimes you may not get it because of the service, maybe because of the preacher's lessons or whatever. But the other thing about not getting anything out of the lesson is you may not have put anything in it. Now, let me explain that one. If you have a bank account and you go to the bank account and you try to draw money out of a bank account that you have no money in, you're not getting anything. That's kind of the way it is when it comes to our services. We don't get out because we don't put in. If we don't put money into that account, we're not going to get money out of that account. If we don't put anything into the worship that we have with God, we're not going to get anything out of it. So it works both ways. The second place is the classroom. If our teachers are not prepared, if they're not encouraging, if they're not building up, if they're not helping us, our teachers need to reevaluate who they are and what they're doing. And third place is the individual efforts. That's where you and I come into play. We need to learn to help one another. And we need to learn to have that ability to be able to say, "Hey, you know what? I can help you there." If I've got an issue with construction of some sort at my house, there's 2 individuals I call. And Bill, you're not the first one. I'm sorry. Jack is. Jack's the first one I call because Jack grew up understanding carpentry. And so he's the first one I call. Then I usually call you and say, "Hey, I've also learned that I can call Jerome or I can call Charles. And I can utilize them in that area. I don't know a lot about carpentry. So I'm usually having to call someone on that. But there's areas that I know that others may need me in. Case in point, individual that doesn't know a lot about technology usually calls me and says, hey, what do you know about this? And I can tell you there's usually one of two answers. I don't have a clue, or have you looked at it? Have you looked here? Have you done this? Because there's some things in technology that change so fast that I don't have the ability to keep up with it. But there are some things I do. Am I the greatest? Nope. There's a guy that I work with that's a whole lot better with IT stuff than I am. And I rely on him. But that's the case. You and I can learn to help and rely on one another in the areas we need. And that's the whole of it. We need to realize what the Bible says. We need to find out what our responsibilities are, and we need to utilize what we have. And this morning, I ask you, if you're outside of the body, or if you're struggling with something and you need help, no matter what the case is, will you let us help? Will you do something about it this morning? Will you walk with God? Will you allow Him to work with you? It's simple. All you have to do is step out and come forward right now. Well, together we stand and sing this invitation song.